Now, first to the April the 4th, 1968, and the assassination of the American civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King had been shot dead in Memphis, Tennessee. He was standing on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis when he sustained a single and fatal bullet wound to the jaw and neck. The police decided the rifle shot had come from a window at the back of the Bessie Brewer's rooming house nearby. A guest at Brewer's had registered as John Willard and was soon linked to a rifle and other items found discarded in front of the rooming house. The FBI later decided Willard had in fact been James Earl Ray, a small-time criminal, though not everyone accepts that. Ray was convicted for the killing and jailed, but questions over who murdered Dr. King have lingered ever since. In a moment, we'll speak to the U.S. Special Investigator who carried out an inquiry into the murder in association with the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations. But first, take a listen to the actual Memphis Police Dispatch audio recording of the shooting of Martin Luther King Jr.
It has been confirmed that the Reverend King has been shot once. 416. 416. 158. 604. 155. You are to form a ring around the hotel. Form a ring around the hotel. Units are responding.
The bullet had knocked him out of his shoes. And I ran up, and there he was laying in his own blood with his whole spinal cord exposed.
Blood is all around his head and neck area. And his eyes are open with almost a pleasant expression on his face. To lay there with his eyes open, looking toward heaven, he had seen the promised land. And he may not get there with us, but he promised that we as a people will see the promised land.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now from Texas by the author and special investigator Gary Revel, who conducted an investigation into the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in association with the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I hope I got your name right, because it's either Revel or Revel.
That's right. Either way is just fine.
Okay, well, we like to get things right. I mean, the British pronunciation would be Revel. But there's been a number of inquiries now into the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, including the one that you conducted between 1977 and 1978 in association with the House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations. How did you get into such a high-profile investigation at the age of just 27?
I was working with Jack Kershaw. He was a partner of mine in Nashville, Tennessee. And I had done some investigative work for him. And one day we were in his office, and he came over to my desk, and he said, I'm going to give you some opportunity to use some of your covert experience that I had when I was in the United States Navy working with naval intelligence to work on this case. And then he said it's concerning the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't immediately jump to that. It seemed a little bit of a large burden to shoulder, but that's how it started.
Well, I mean, it's quite fascinating. And then tell us how it progressed.
Well, once I really felt like God wanted me to do it, I accepted the job, and I went and I met with James Earl Ray at Brushy Mountain Prison, a very gothic and sinister-looking building there in Petros, Tennessee. But once I heard James' story, once he confided in me in ways that he wouldn't confide with anyone else, not even attorneys, I realized that the man was Yeah, I needed to look at it. It really seemed like he was an innocent man.
And what exactly did he tell you?
Well, he told me he told me his whole story. I mean, he went all the way back from when he was in prison. He was in prison there at Springfield, and how folks helped him escape and led him to Canada, where he met with Lucien Sardi and E. Howard Hunt. And from that point on, they directed him. They managed him, directed him, gave him money to do this thing. And really, they set him up to take the fall for the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
But in terms of what you actually found, I mean, you were a professional investigator. I mean, did it seem to you like he actually pulled the trigger? Although he might have been set up to do it, but did he actually pull the trigger?
No. I found out that actually he was 3 or 4 blocks away from the building when that shot was fired. He was at a service station, and he had just been on the phone to the Town and Country Motel in Louisiana, which is the headquarters for Carlos Marcello, who's the mob boss for the entire southern tier of the United States. There's no way he could have been guilty, because he wasn't even in the building when the shot was fired.
Well, I mean, that's what he said, but most of the investigations carried out so far into Martin Luther King's killing have concluded that there was no evidence that anyone other than James Earl Ray assassinated Dr. King. I mean, and clearly you're saying that's not what you found. And in supporting what you're saying, there appear to be persistent doubts that he was solely responsible for the shooting.
That's right. Well, that is a theory. That's a lone nut gunman type theory that they use also for Oswald and others. But the fact is that the gun that King was supposedly shot with, that had Ray's thumbprint on it, has never, to this day, that they've tried every way possible with all kind of forensic experts and gun experts and metal experts to connect that gun with the bullet that killed Martin Luther King, and they've never been able to do it. To this day, they can't say this is the gun. They pretend they can say it, but the fact is they've never connected that bullet to that gun.
And of course, James Earl Ray, who was imprisoned for the murder until his death from liver disease in 1998, retracted his initial confession. I mean, he did confess, and then he retracted that confession, didn't he? And he spent many futile years seeking a new trial.
That's right, but he did not really confess. If you study the transcript of the court, and I did this because of what he told me, but I found that what he told me was true, because he was there, and he even interrupted at one point, saying he didn't agree with the prosecutors, with the FBI. He didn't agree with them, but he was pleading guilty anyway. Now at that point, he was saying, I kind of agree that I may have been involved, but I didn't do it. But the judge at that time, Percy Foreman, took James by the shoulder, pushed him back down in his seat, and interrupted him, and the judge just forgot it and went on. Now here's the thing. In my practice, in my study of the law and working with lawyers for many years, I found that a good judge, if a defendant stands up and interrupts the proceedings, basically saying that he doesn't agree with the charges, that judge has got to look into that and tell him, well, Mr. Ray, you can't plead guilty and then say you're not pleading guilty to the charges that we have against you. And immediately the next day, he did write a letter to the judge saying he did not plead guilty. He wanted a trial by jury.
Right, okay. We'll continue with this. Please stay with us. Absolutely fascinating story. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the author and U.S. Special Investigator Gary Revel, who conducted an inquiry for Congress into the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, my first guest today, Gary Revel, has made his name out of investigating at the highest level the assassinations of America's best-known leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., John Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. In addition to his extraordinary history of investigations, navigating twists and turns, and uncovering explosive information in his search for the unvarnished truth, Mr. Revel has written several books, including Don't Stop Dancing, Stranger Than Fiction, which is the result of his investigation into the life of the pop star Michael Jackson. His inquiry into the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. is now being developed into a new movie with a working title, They Slew the Dreamer, MLK, The Gary Revel Story. And the author and all-American sleuth, Gary Revel, is still with me on the line from Texas. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. So, is it your sense that there was or may have been a broader assassination conspiracy?
There's no doubt about it.
About your theory?
Well, I don't have a theory, and that's one of the things that's a little different between me and many others. All I have done is I investigated the case. I went very deep, met with mobsters, and had people killed around me. My associate Bill Sullivan, who was the federal head of domestic intelligence for J. Edgar Hoover, he was killed a week before he was to testify. My younger brother was killed. I went through the hell of my investigation to the point that I knew beyond any doubt that James Earl Ray did not shoot and kill Martin Luther King Jr.
I mean, apart from obviously expressing sympathies for your loss as a result of this investigation, I was going to ask you how your investigation actually ended in 1978 and what happened subsequently. I mean, you've told us a bit about that now because, I mean, your recent chronicles in your book, To Live or Maybe Not, suggests that danger, intrigue, and murder followed that investigation.
That's right, and there did come a time after my brother was killed, and I met with some of the representatives, I'll say, of the murderers down in around Miami Beach, Florida, one day, and they basically told me, you don't want what happened to your brother to happen to your wife and children. And with that information, when I got back to Nashville, Tennessee, and I found my apartment completely destroyed, everything was moved out of it. It was apparent they were in there looking for files. And then ultimately, they did steal all of my files related to my investigation, every scrap of paper. It went missing. And at that point, then I found Bill Sullivan had been killed a week before he was to testify. At that point, I realized I could never prove anything. Therefore, I would just have to lay low for a while. And I did. I went back to Hollywood, California, and I laid low for about 20 years before I began to really get brave enough to start talking about it again.
And again, whilst expressing sympathies for what you went through, I mean, I'm just wondering why they didn't go for you rather than your brother and the other people.
Well, that's a question I've asked myself. That's a question I've dealt with many, many times. You know, they say, well, how come you're still alive, you know? But I think the key to it was like Bill Sullivan told me once. He said, knowing too little will get you killed, but knowing more than enough will provide insurance for you. And I think the fact that they knew that I knew, and yet I chose to at some point just keep quiet about it, I think that was part of the reason. I mean, I wasn't intimidating. I didn't have no bravado or nothing like that against anyone in that sphere. And so pretty much, I think I went along and did what they wanted me to do for about 20 years.
And so after those incidents, those terrible incidents, you obviously stopped your investigation. And then subsequent to that, I mean, yours died down, but there was another investigation that was commissioned under the Clinton administration when Janet Reno was the Attorney General of the United States. That also concluded that it was James Earl Ray who did the killing.
That's right, and I actually was I was brought to the federal courthouse in Los Angeles to provide evidence for that too. They made copies of my tapes, my audio tapes that I'd made with James Earl Ray, and they asked me a few questions. So I was part of that investigation too, but they did not agree with me on the conclusions, and that's what I mean. I just investigated and produced the facts of my investigation, and I don't have a conspiracy theory as such. I just tell people what I know by what I experienced and what I found in my investigation. So that's what makes, see, I'm the real thing. I really did these things. I really did investigate myself. I didn't research and look for what other people said. I only go by what I found out myself.
Well, absolutely, and that's what makes your story absolutely fascinating. But of course, that's not the only investigation that you've carried out. You also investigated the assassination of the former U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert. What emerged from your inquiries there?
Well, that's the whole point. The MLK assassination investigation that I did led me to the JFK and then to the RFK assassinations because they're tied together. They have an overriding modus operandi, and they have an overriding motive, in that there was a group of people who wanted to keep the Vietnam War going. And both John Kennedy was about to end it. Martin Luther King came out and spoke against it on April 4th, 1967. Then he was killed exactly 1 year later. And then 2 months after, shortly after they arrested James Earl Ray, and just a couple of months after they killed King, that's when Robert Kennedy was killed.
Well, absolutely. That's clearly a historical fact. And of course, beyond those three leaders, you also investigated the life of the pop star Michael Jackson. I mean, what did you unearth, and what was the focus of the book you wrote about him?
I was living in Hollywood, and my daughter had done some background vocals for Michael Jackson, and one of her former producers arranged a meeting with me where he asked me to get the truth out. He had heard about my investigation of the King thing and stuff, and found out about me, and he asked me to get the truth out about the Michael Jackson story. And that his name was Ben Brown. We met in Hollywood at Musso Frank's Grill, and that's where that story began. And I did. When I started looking into it, I found out that Michael Jackson had a little hit record in Gary, Indiana, long before Motown. And I found out that it was being hidden. It was being kept under wraps. For some reason, the powers that be didn't want it to be known by the public. And that's the kind of a thing that interests me, is why would people not want truth to be known? So that's when I went into that.
So, I mean, we've got less than a minute. It's been fascinating talking with you. But here you are, you've carried out high-level investigations into the assassinations of America's best-known leaders. You've written several books. Your story is being developed into a movie, and you're also a singer and a songwriter. So what happens next?
Well, I'm a book publisher now. I publish some very interesting books. I continue to sing and make records and produce and distribute music, and now I'm developing and putting together motion pictures. So that's what I'm doing. And I mean, I don't investigate per se anymore. I mean, I look into things, but I don't put on that hat as an investigator anymore. I'm just developing and making entertainment product for the most part, books, movies, and music.
Okay, I want to thank you very much indeed, Gary Revel, the U.S. Special Investigator and author, for joining us and talking to us about your investigation into the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King.